Okay,
about 40 of Boston, so
we're gonna get. So how close are you to Boston? Sorry.
40 minutes.
Oh, that's nothing. So that's even more advantageous. In other words, you excuse us, everybody. We're finishing our conversation, Simon Andrews and I, about his living accommodations, which are apparently 40 miles north of Boston. A converted barn. Pay attention, everyone. That's what we all dream about. Full of objets. There are references that we will discuss. There's a skull there that's pure Georgia O'Keeffe and so on. Anyway, I am having a wonderful interview already with English composer Simon Andrews, who has been in this country in the U.S. long enough to, to one questions your authenticity as a full-blown British composer. I'm being
Oh,
obviously facetious.
it's confusing, isn't it? I've been here 30 years, so
It's your interest in the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, which is in your CD that we're going to be talking about here, among other things, and influences in music making and poetry of Emily Dickinson, and so on. The CD we're talking about, 2018 Navona release, wonderful company. It's called, and this is when I went crazy when you sent this to me. It's called, as if we need complicated CD titles. It's called "And That Moment When the Bird Sings." And I thought, what on earth is this going to be? It's of course, a compilation of your chamber music for diverse instruments, including voice, and it's a wonderful distillation of a sort of powerful artistic mantra, if you don't mind my suggesting, narrative structure.
yes, I think that
That's
says it well.
that's what I get from the CD. When things are just beautiful, so beautifully put together. In other words, you're brilliant. I love your music making. More people need to see and listen to this CD and perform your music. And that's not me being patronizing. It's me discovering your music. Really,
Well,
really quite a pleasure. Uh,
thank you.
this CD kind of distills 30 years or more of teaching in the U.S. and your UK roots. It's also, by the way, you were at Franklin and Marshall for a while. So was my pal from high school, John Carbon, Dr.
Oh,
John
right,
Carbon.
yes,
I
we
don't
were
know.
classmates.
I don't know
Yeah,
if that rings any bells or not, but he's a Santa Barbaran, and
yes.
I've known him
I
most of my.
hadn't made that connection. Of course, yeah, we were there at the same time. We were the two composers on campus.
Ah,
All 7 years. He's still there. So,
yes, yeah, and that's called survival.
yes,
In
yeah.
an academic
And
situation.
he's written some great music. A
I
very fine, actually, by a strange coincidence, a very fine clarinet concerto written for the same clarinetist that played my piece.
Ah, let's be sure and remember us about this clarinets, because of course there are diverse musicians on this CD of yours. But let me just what intrigues me is Emily Dickinson. Period. This is a genius. Anyone who writes, whatever, 14-word gems and then stashes them in the wall work is a genius for someone to discover later. But I'm going to just quote, if you don't mind. You say, I compose music that will take the listener on a journey. That's what we're talking about in terms of narrative. If they are willing, but it is their journey, not mine. And I think that's the most beautiful way that I've ever heard a composer put it, which is we all are entitled as listeners to go on our own journeys. You have yours that inspired you for some of these pieces, and we, all of us, might create our own, but it's entirely our own journey, and that's part of your responsibility, is to give us a journey at very least. If I have done my job well, you say, it could even be different at each listening. Now that's something, kind of like Beethoven's Fifth, different at each listening. The pieces we come back to again and again, you say, or books or poems or paintings for that matter, speak to us on a level that is hard to put into words. Of course, that's what high art is. That is their strength. It is what I think we aim for as composers, you say, to create a sound world that invites the listener back and suggests that there are more treasures to be discovered. End quote. I have never heard it put more distinctly. It must be your English education.
Who knows? It also sets the bar quite high, which is why I write very slowly and have written fairly little.
You know, you've mentioned that earlier. I think somewhere in the program notes or one of your pages. By the way, all of this, our interview and the excerpts and how to buy the CD, all that stuff is going to go up at performingartsreview.net. But I found that interesting, because you never know really what the result is going to be or how people will react to what you do. So
That's absolutely true.
now, how is it? How is it that I'm speaking of? Well, I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit, but I'm really intrigued by your. You've chosen a couple of the CD has so many wonderful works. Let's just talk about a few of them just a bit. I'm just going to grab the CD; it's easier for me. The CD opens with Violin Dialogues 1 and 2. That is with violin and piano, and that is yourself on piano and Joanna Kirkovitz, I hope I'm pronouncing her name properly, on fiddle. That is a purely instrumental work. It's marvelous. It's interesting. It's complex. But you that is probably the only piece on this CD that does not have some kind of literary connection, or does it? Speak to me about that piece.
I don't think it does. I think it does. Other than the idea of dialogue, and I could get very nerdy and tell you about how the violin has one group of 8 notes, and I have the complementary group of 8 notes, and then blah blah blah. So I could get very all Berkeley on about that. But sometimes it's a good exercise to write something where you don't give the listener a clue by a literary cue like that, and the moment when the bird sings, or something else like that. My symphony is called "For the Heart is an Organ of Fire," which is one of my favorite quotes from the English Patient. And that gives you kind of a clue on what one is going for. But in violin dialogues, sometimes you just know that's pretty pared back music. There aren't many gestures that aren't that are grandiose. It's very pared back, almost spare music.
Yes, yes.
And I wanted people to be able to follow it like a dialogue in a play.
And by the way, it's beautifully organized, and it's a wonderful work for fiddle and pianists to have a look at. So I hope those out in my grouping of professionals. That's part of what my email database is all about. We'll have a look. And this has been the great, wonderful experience for me in the past year, is enjoying and discovering so much incredible, really incredible music. Well, you know what gets me is how you can write an entirely instrumental piece. I hope I'm not being repetitive, And That Moment When the Bird Sings, and we'll discuss that for a moment, the title piece, and expect listeners to, quote, hear what you have in mind in terms of the words, their meaning. Tell me, what are your expectations? I mean, how does a composer do this? You set things up for us as the audience, right? With a title like that. How does it work?
Well, for me, I'm trying to engage the audience's imagination before they hear a note of the piece. Because when you hear the title, you're already reacting to what you think that means for you. I mentioned in our little conversation before you hit the record button, the Noam Chomsky quote, which I love, and it's called "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously," which is grammatically correct, but in the real world doesn't mean anything. But when you start unplugging or digging a little deeper, there are any numbers of resonances, of poetic meanings of what that could mean. And for me, that's what writing music is like. And when I go to a concert and hear a piece I haven't heard before, that's what listening to a piece of music is like. And that's why I'm hoping the journey will be different each time somebody listens to my piece, because I've set up situations that are clear enough. No, not clear enough. Set up situations which are vibrant enough to have multiple interpretations.
Well, that's very beautifully spoken indeed, and that's in a way you've answered my question, which is that part of me is asking, when a composer sets a situation with words, a direct quote from a poet or something, but you have actually given us license as audience to go right ahead to, of course, maybe have a look and enjoy this poesy, but also to enjoy our own fantasies about what you, regardless of what you had in mind in the course of
Absolutely.
creation. Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that my music is like the Mona Lisa, but everyone that looks at that thing either doesn't see a smile or has a different version of why is she smiling? What's she thinking? What happens? Blah, 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 blah. So, or the lilies, or whatever painting you want to say. Michelangelo's David. Everyone has a different reaction to that statue. And
oh, he's naked. Oh no, he's yeah. I've got you. And by the way, a brilliant explanation for that. In other words, you don't need to give me any explanation whatsoever. It's entirely up to an audience to decide what they're listening to, regardless of what you send them as a message or not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think when we listen to the Alpine Symphony, we're necessarily supposed to experience snow and avalanches and blue skies and sub-zero temperatures. But that's what inspired. Actually, perhaps with that piece, he really wanted us to, but that's more his psychology than mine.
Yeah. And besides, there is a hero involved somewhere there. It's not Ein Heldenleben, but Alpine Symphony. It's like the mountain is a hero of the story.
There's always a hero somewhere in that piece.
Here's what we're going to look at for a moment. You and I mentioned a little earlier. I had heard a little bit. And of course, you buy the book and then you don't read it, and all of a sudden you're in the nursing home. But Seamus Heaney's, have I pronounced his name correctly? Seamus is an S-H. Seamus Heaney, the famous Irish writer and poet. I encountered him with a brilliant review of Beowulf. He rewrote and reimagined Beowulf. But you use this Irish poet's Nobel Prize winner for literature in 1995. This wonderful song in your "The Earth Is Hollow." I'm just going to read it for everyone, just to kind of give an idea of the importance of the poem, and then you're going to tell us how that works. I have seen the picture of a particular tree in question. Here we go. A rowan like a lipsticked girl. You and I've had this conversation earlier. A rowan. I thought, what the hell is that? Looked it up. It's an incredible tree that blushes, if you will, with a red lipsticky kind of foliage. So here we go again. A rowan like a lipsticked girl between the by road and the main road. Alder trees at a wet and dripping distance stand off among the rushes. I have been a student in London. I know all about wet and dripping distance. The sopping wet climate of Britain. It's so beautifully spoken. Elder trees at a wet and dripping distance. There are the mud flowers of dialect. I wish I knew what that meant. And the immortelles of perfect pitch. And that moment when the bird sings very close to the music of what happens. How did you go from reading that to the work of art that you created in terms of music? Please tell me the secret. I need to know.
How would you feel if you were standing looking at that tree and being dripped on?
Wet. I'm being somewhat silly, but I have no idea how I would feel. It's like, oh, this tree, it's crazy and it's wet and dripping on me. I'm not a good student.
There's a physical thing that's in the real world,
Yeah.
and yet you were thinking this tree is beautiful. The phrase lipsticked right away tells you that he is not just there in that place. He's in He's in more than one place at once. Is it his mother? Is it a girlfriend? Is it a wife? Is it someone he saw across the other side of the room? And suddenly your imagination is gone.
Brilliant.
And that's why I start with a kind of A major, A minor. That's the real world. And then going the strings, you can't really feel a pulse at the beginning of that, so you've got a bit of timelessness, just like a field. If a wide field with trees, you don't really have a sense of spatial divisions. And then the clarinet comes in, hinting at A major minor, and then you're off somewhere else very quickly, because the imagination leads you off.
That's all I'm
going to tell you.
Well, that's more than most composers tell me. by the way. But it helps greatly for all of us, even those of us in the profession. I mean, the how composers work, how they use tonality, how they think about tonality, and you've just described beautifully an idea of tonality to express, for example, a wide open field. It's quite an astonishing idea.
It really, it's the rhythm that represents the field. For me, the tonality, however hard we try and get away from it, there is something about a chord structure that we recognize, even if it's just two notes, that anchors us in where we are comfortable. Even Webern's sparsest pieces, he knew that. Stravinsky, in his spartest and his most harmonically extreme, still knew how to root us in expectations. And unless you're rooted, you can't be on a journey. If it's just there's a mass of sound everywhere, then there's nowhere to call home. And the listener needs somewhere to refer back to, so that you know, I've been somewhere.
And also, you might have just explained, because it has been intriguing to me for some time, and I've forgotten the title of it. I hope I still have it somewhere packed away in the books in the storage shed. But the treatise from whatever, let's say the 1750s, I think you know what I'm referring to. This treatise that explains that this key area explains that particular emotional response, and so on. I mean, an entire
the Baroque doctrine of the affections.
Thank you very much. But that, and by the way, as you have just described, it is still in use. In other words, there is something about certain tonalities that result in an emotional response from human beings, as then, still now. Yeah.
I think that's, for many listeners, that's true. Thomas Addis, the great English composer, is in love with A major. He loves A major. If you listen to his orchestral Tevot, it begins and ends in A major, and all these huge cycle of fifths things. But it's not, for him, it's A major. For a different composer, it might have been F or C or F sharp, or whatever. But it's the fact that we have an anchoring point that we move away from it back to, and then we're just hoping that the piece of elastic that brings us back doesn't break. Or the stream, mix as many metaphors as possible, that some damn bird hasn't come in and eaten the breadcrumbs so we can find our way back. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, in a crazy sort of metaphorical sort of way. What I'd like to discuss...
That's why I write music rather than words, because I can only say it in music.
But you lie, because you use words.
I do.
You know, this CD, I'm going through heaps of CDs of all kinds of music, wonderful stuff, but this is word-centered. Yeah? Come on.
It is.
You know, and that moment when the bird sings. Now, you know, it could have been jolly music for chamber orchestra, or for chamber ensembles. You know, it could have been anything, but you chose something that, as I first looked at it, I thought, Simon Andrews. First of all, I thought, now, who is that? Frankly, you know what I mean? Now I'm glad to meet you and understand that your music is so fabulous. And then this title, and that moment when the bird sings, and I thought, well, what kind of crazy marketing is this? So anywho, as you can see, this is a CD full of imagery, obviously. Can I speak for a moment? Why don't I? Not me. I need to let you speak about, because I fell in love with the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival many years ago in my youth when I was in Seattle. Brought them all the way up to Seattle. I think I went broke about in the second summer, but they managed to hang in there for 10 years or so after I had first brought them there. But there is something about not only the artwork of Georgia O'Keeffe. You know where I'm going. I want you to speak about these three pieces, but Abiquiu, which is Georgia O'Keeffe territory. We're not talking Albuquerque, we're talking Abiquiu, this tiny little place in the middle of the beautiful desert and the clear blue skies. What is it? What is the Georgia O'Keeffe Abiquiu connection? And you're an Englishman. Tell me, what happened? Where'd you go wrong?
Well, that's a conversation for a whole other day. I do not have a good answer for that. When I got off the plane, drove into the desert, and fell in love. It was just absolutely amazing. From this Englishman that grew up with the lush rolling hills of Sussex and Kent in the south of England, there was a beauty to that scenery that was just breathtaking. There's something about when things are that dry and pared down to its essentials, that which is something I try to capture in the Abiquiu Trio piece.
Beautiful. Beautifully put.
It's so outside my experience that it was very inspiring. Inspiring is the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
And by the way, that would probably be exactly what Georgia O'Keeffe herself would have said. Coming from New York City.
Absolutely.
You know, making that choice, somehow landing in Abiquiu, New Mexico.
And when there was so much less of it then in the 30s and 40s than there is now even. I mean, there wasn't even the civilization 20 miles or 40 miles away that there is now.
So amazing the effect of a natural environment on people, even as sophisticated as yourself, for example, but also someone from a huge major city, the busyness of the big city and cosmopolitan, all that sort of thing. So the beauty of the landscape is it. Now, therefore, how is it that I'm just looking down, forgive me for looking down, but the Abiquiu Trio, how you, 3 movements, landscape, light, untitled, red and yellow cliffs. I've looked at all. I know these 3 artworks of Georgia O'Keeffe so well. I mean, you know, I'm trying to get composers to tell me what is it. You look at an artwork and what creates the musical colors that, for example, coincide with cliffs. Just as an example. How does that work?
Let me just say, sometimes the title comes last.
You cheater. Okay, go ahead.
Well, not just me. You know, we were before we started. We were talking about the Threnody on the victims of Hiroshima. Yeah. That title came long after the piece was composed.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so it fit.
Interesting.
It's not entirely true. All 3 movements were substantially sketched out before I decided on the titles, and the titles did inform the shape of the piece and the length of the piece. And I called the last piece Untitled, Red and Yellow Cliffs, because I wanted it to be generic in terms of a title, because the way that piece is organized is all on a single plain song melody. Every single note in that comes from the plain song melody. Because we stayed a couple of days in the Christ in the Desert Monastery, which is a wonderful place to visit. It's a functioning Benedictine monastery where they still make everything and are completely self-sufficient and hold the church offices every hour, at the right time every day. And you sit in the services and they chant them. And I just thought, this Christian tradition of singing the services is 1,500 years old, and that's young by comparison with the landscape. And it was just, it absolutely fascinated me. So, as I say in the program notes, in the same way that life in a 6th century monastery would be unrecognizable to a 21st century person, the way I treat the plain song melody is unrecognizable. And I do it the opposite way around to composers do it. They normally state things and get complicated. Don't hear the melody until the very, very end of the piece in mind.
That's clearly why I missed it. Damn. Okay, but I just simply did not make that connection. But of course, your description is exactly perfect. You heard something in that moment, in that space. Am I correct there?
You're right.
Yeah. And likewise for the other 2 movements, or did that just compel you into the other 2 movements? I'm just so curious about how composers work.
Well, the middle movement, Light, Doris, the clarinet player, Doris Hall Galati, fabulous clarinet player. She can hold a note quieter and longer than anyone else on the planet I've ever heard. And that first note, and it goes on for something like 20 seconds, and she probably was only halfway through her lung capacity. And just playing with that and the plucked tone on the piano strings and an open double and a double stop on the violin, for me that just was completely out of time. And again, time's a big thing for me. But that's just like looking into a blinding light. That note is like looking into a blinding light, or a medical instrument that just does a beep tone when your heart's not working, or I mean, whatever it is. It was just, so that's why that movement is called light. And then there's just the blinding, the piano clusters that are quite, that are very glass-like. It's blinding of the light. And then when the light goes behind a shadow, you've got those unrelated, very tonal chords that are shadow and dark and the relief when you look away from the sun. So that's what's going on in that movement.
How can I possibly follow that description? That is incredible. I want to refer to another Emily Dickinson poem. I love the way you. When did you discover Emily Dickinson, by the way? Was it just an accident or what?
Actually, when I was at Berkeley, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
Crazy Berkeley introduced you to 19th century Emily Dickinson, who, by the way, was a radical.
One of my colleagues had set something, and I was probably playing piano in it. So, and I thought, oh, this is cool. And immediately went out and bought the collected edition, and just didn't see me for days because I was just reading and reading and reading. I've said about 7 or 8 of her poems. I love them.
And she's so succinct, as is your music. I think that's the beauty of the connection between you two. I'm thinking of The Heart Has Narrow Banks. The heart has narrow banks, it measures like the sea, in mighty unremitting bass and blue monotony. I love her use of words. Till hurricane bisect, and as itself discerns its sufficient area, the heart convulsive learns.
Isn't that a wonderful line?
But there's more. The heart convulsive learns that calm is but a wall of unattempted gauze. An instant's push demolishes, a questioning dissolves. And again, the question is, how does a composer's mind take this literary, beautiful, all this imagery, and somehow make music out of it?
Because there are so many images, how could you not respond to it?
So the hurricane, for example.
Hurricane is obvious.
Convulsive, I suppose.
Convulsive, monotony, I mean, that's a rhythmic thing there. Blue, that could be a lot of different things. But again, I can only suggest. I mean, I suppose if someone could have done a jazz blue chord or something in there, but that's very prescriptive. What I try to just do is the ebb and flow of ideas and suggest possibilities. Now, I talked with Celeste, who's a wonderful singer, Celeste Godin,
yes.
About how I thought that the unattempted gauze could be the bit of gauze down there that the women's dresses had sometimes in those days. So is she talking about a lover? An instant's push demolishes. Did someone make a grab for her? Did she want someone to make a grab for her? Her questioning dissolves. Did he question whether he should and then decides, no, I mustn't? So there are so many layers of meaning that I just tried to create a sense of longing and let the audience's imagination do the rest.
Yeah, and rather...
That's fantastic singing.
Yes, indeed, and rather like Nostradamus, you never know. I mean, there's the discernible meanings. You just described something that hadn't quite. I was thinking gauze as more of a sort of a color, a haze.
And that's just as good.
Yeah.
That is just as good.
Now tell me, what's up next? What's going on in your life right now? Speak to me.
A couple of things. I'm writing, again, it's literary, I'm sorry, but I'm writing my 3rd string quartet called Rilke Episodes, because I love the sonnets of Orpheus, and sonnets to Orpheus, and I'm taking 1 or 2 sentences and writing 7, and I haven't chosen all the sentences yet, pieces for string quartet, because I love writing for string quartet. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, because there's nowhere to hide. But again, the possibilities for dialogue, but still a rich harmonic vocabulary with 4 players. So I'm doing that, but I'm also, my biggest job, and again, it's Santa Fe related. I'm finishing up an opera on the 1680 Pueblo Revolt,
Now I read about this, and I even remember something about this Pueblo revolt. Tell us a little bit about it, because it was an uprising of the people against the established.
Of the Native Americans in 1680. There was a very charismatic leader called Pope, that managed to unite most of the little pueblos that were up to 30 or 40 miles apart and didn't even speak the same language. But he went round and talked to them, and eventually realized he inspired them that they could do it together. And then 5 days, he coordinated the rebellion by sending out runners with knotted ropes. And on sundown every day, a rope was untied, a knot was untied, and each runner had a different number of knots in the rope. And the morning after the last rope was untied in all the pueblos, they all just descended and rebelled against them, beat the Spanish in their local towns, and then went down to Santa Fe.
This is Spartacus.
It's not
Spartacus.
like that.
Yeah, Spartacus West.
Or and then 12 years later, he disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. So he's kind of this King Arthur figure as well. He unites against the Saxons and everything. Big, fantastic battle. So I'm working on. I'm almost done with that. And
will this be a Santa Fe Opera debut? I mean, have you been commissioned by the opera there, or are you
I wish I had been commissioned. We are deep in conversation about it.
This is good.
The politics of casting are very complicated in Santa Fe, because obviously it would be insulting to have a non-Native American singer sing the roles. There are very few Native American singers, which is not something that I knew before I took on the role. But the fascinating thing about Pope is that, according to the Native Americans, there are two traditions. One is he a shaman, a spiritual leader, in which case he would have been incapable of taking life, or was he a war captain, a military leader? And rather than choose one or the other, I make that an internal dialogue between him, so that the two sides of his character.
Now we have Julius Caesar.
to mention a few, yes.
To mention a few. Wow, so, what a project.
And that's the central thing that impels the drama. And so that's been a 2.5, 3 year project.
That's the thing about composing operas, from those colleagues that I do know, it's such an enormous effort.
Especially as I'm doing the words as well. So
and pardon? About the words?
I'm writing the libretto as well.
I'm not surprised somehow, but also
us to do it. So,
but I mean, there you go. But just the tremendous. People don't have any idea what a tremendous amount of hours and blood and sweat and tears and creative energy is involved, especially for an operatic work that then may be performed twice in a generation, perhaps.
You mean I get a second performance? That would be very exciting.
So tell me, why do you do it? I'm speaking to you generic, the composers who of all the repertoire you can create, there's something about this engagement, this theater, musical theater, if you will, possibility that, and especially in your case, because you are obviously so involved in literature and literary analogies. Is that why? You're just going to do it?
I've conducted about 20-25 operas. I love it. It's a unique medium. That have that combination, the Gesamtkunstwerk. I mean, that's a loaded Wagnerian term, but there's something about the combination of the way I like to compose music, which is what we've been talking about, plus the element of theatre, which people can speak so formally to formally. What word am I trying to use? That my vocabulary is letting me down. They can speak so directly to somebody, and even though one of the reasons that this story spoke to me so much, it's still, even though it's a 400-year-old event, it's still current. It's about colonialism. It's about racism. It's about cultural imperialism. It's about inner choices. It's just an opera story, except that the soprano doesn't die.
Oh, really? But he dies.
We don't know.
He's not drawn and quartered by the Spanish later. No? Come on.
No, by the time they came back in 1692, he was dead. Nobody knows why.
Ah, okay. A
It's
nice quiet death in the desert. Let's assume he walked off into the desert to have a quiet death. Let's assume that, as opposed to drawing and quartering. But what a story! Because as again, it's a is it a metaphor? It is, I guess, what I mentioned, Spartacus and others, leaders who rise up when things are so intolerable. Finally, someone comes forward. I presume this might be a similar sort of circumstance, and then they are usually put down, if you will, but their ideas and their idealism and all the rest triumphs. What a great idea! And what are you calling the opera? Pray.
Tentative title at the moment is Popeye, which is the gentleman's name,
Yeah.
the First American Revolution. So
First American Revolution, marvelous.
as a kind of title, subtext. So it's almost done.
Simon Andrews, English composer, though resident in America long enough to have been extremely powerfully influenced, apparently, so that your music is much more universal and international. I hope I'm not in trouble yet, but because you are as much American.
Compliment, thank you.
And you are as much American as you are British, I would think, at this point. Yeah? Yeah.
My friends will probably disagree with you about that, but artistically that was probably true.
After all, the topics you have chosen in this wonderful CD, and that moment when the bird sings. And again, I'm going to put all of this information in the interview up at performingartsreview.net. I hope people will check in and have a good look at your work. But so many kind of North American centered influences in your life.
That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah. Very creative, by the way. It's funny how a young part of the world, the North American continent, has so much rich history and so many fabulous stories to tell.
Absolutely. Yes.
Simon Andrews, not that Britain doesn't have plenty to speak of, Richard and the Richards and the Plantagenet and so on. But Simon Andrews, what a great pleasure having a chat with you tonight. We're speaking of his. Hang on, I got to go up here and find it. His Hawaii. I've just told the title, and that moment when the bird sings CD that you will never forget. I'm going to make sure nobody forgets that title. We'll see if we can get some people tuned into it. But a beautiful, beautiful CD. By the way, incredible levels of just the quality of the sound. You know what I mean about the sound engineering.
Yeah, Palmer Records did a great job. We had a wonderful lead engineer that actually, strange coincidence, we worked together on a Morton Feldman CD 25 years ago when I was singing at Berkeley. So he has an incredible ear and knew exactly which the best takes were, and we never disagreed.
Yeah,
so he wonderful. Palmer, they were fantastic about the whole enterprise, and the players were fantastic.
Yeah.
So,
and it is a small world in our profession. Yeah, we run into each other over and over again. Anyway, Simon, I guess we'll wind it down. I could speak to you for hours, but thanks very much indeed for giving me some time in the evening. And we will speak again. I hope. I'd love to know what exactly is the meaning of that face back on the wall there. It looks extremely ancient and ancient and forbidding.
I have a thing about masks, so I love collecting masks. So.
Wonderful. Anyway, thanks very much indeed for.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure. A lot of fun. Nice to get to know you.
Right on. Bye-bye.